Thank you. Morning, everyone. I think I'm glad Samir got some numbers out of the way on his slides. I have no numbers in my slides. So the idea was to have a conversation and talk about really perspective sharing when it comes to leadership and how do we think about leadership in the context of what's obviously feels like the biggest change of our times, of our lifetimes. So there was a comment that Samir made that really stayed with me, which is that if you're not part of the Gen AI wave, then you're finished. So I thought I'm glad I had this as my first slide. This is the Porto de Nara Nazar in Portugal, which is famed for the 100-feet waves. A surfer's paradise. I'm not a surfer, so I just like looking at the picture. It looks pretty scary to be in that water. But what's interesting is, if you're in the water there, the one thing you can't do about that wave is ignore it. Right? So you better figure out how to ride that wave. You may get it wrong a few times, but finally you've got to learn to ride the wave, because if you ignore the wave, and if you see the movie Chasing Mavericks, he talks about the fact that it falls on you like a slab of concrete, which is, I think, what I took away from Samir's conversation as well. So at least what I'm going to spend some time talking about is, how do you think about this, again, from just a leadership vantage point, but also obviously for the firms that we lead, that we're part of, the thought leadership that we are trying to kind of obviously perpetuate, and examine a few dimensions of it. So I'm going to start with, it's always good to start with a story, right? Stories are how we make meaning out of life. So what I call the success trap. So I'm going to start with a very non-digital example, field hockey. I don't know, for those, I'm just trying to do a quick gauge of age groups in the room, but most of you may or may not remember this. The Indian hockey team used to be world leading at one point in time. 1980 Moscow Olympics, gold medalists. 1990 London World Cup, came 12th out of 12, right? So that's a fairly fall from grace. And what is interesting is the biggest change between 1980 and 1990. Anyone in the audience? Just to check if everybody's still there. AstroTurf. Sandeep, thank you. I knew you would have got it. So AstroTurf. Now, what is interesting about AstroTurf is that it didn't change the rules of the game. It changed the game itself. Because in 1980, it was about field hockey played on grass, stick work, individual brilliance. It was all about craftsmanship. 1990, AstroTurf was all about speed, stamina. An average person ran 6 times more than they ran on the field during a game as compared to 1980. So fitness, set pieces, penalty corners, formation, strategies, completely changed. Interestingly, in 1990, when India came 12th out of 12, there were 6 AstroTurfs in the country. There were 350 in Netherlands. No guesses where Netherlands finished in the 1990 World Cup. Now, what's important is to make sure that we don't miss the AstroTurf moment in our lives, right? And with Gen AI, just because you're successful at what you do today doesn't mean it can't change. Someone was once asked, how do you go bankrupt? And they said, very slowly at first, and then all of a sudden, right? So what we want to make sure is that we are staying tuned into the change that's happening, because it's already happening. And not just rest on the laurels of what we see today. There's always one fundamental assumption that each one of us is making that we think is unshakable, and that is the assumption that will break. And when that breaks, we're not prepared for it. So if you think about exponential shifts, and this is what we're in, right? So Gen AI, you saw all the numbers that Samir had put out there. It's definitely the biggest change of our times, maybe the biggest since the internet, and you can come up with a few more other shifts that have happened. But there's something common to most big shifts that have happened. We've always overestimated any big shift in its first 5 years and grossly underestimated it in the next 10. So whatever Samir's numbers were, and I'm sure those are right, I'm sure we're overestimating that. And whatever his numbers would have been for 5 years from now, we're grossly underestimating it, because that's just how these shifts happen. So we always will have a shift that happens, and then we go through the depths of despondency, because, go back to the internet. The internet, when it came about and everybody was excited about it, there was the bubble burst and everybody got disappointed. Why? Because they said, oh, all I'm doing is I'm publishing my management team's brochure onto the website now. And someone said, but what about if we transact on the web? People said, oh, that's too far away. That's never going to happen, right? And then that started to happen, and when it happened, there was just no stopping that. So similarly, I think with Gen AI, what we've got to figure out is, what are the shifts that are happening? Which are the ones we are tuning into? And as they say, the future is already here. It just hasn't arrived everywhere as yet. So there are a lot of firms that are already making those moves. I don't know if you've heard about the Create Magic platform that Coke launched, right? They're already doing a Gen AI-based platform where consumers and the brand are actually co-creating campaigns together. And they're giving the individuals the credit. I mean, that's a very different way of thinking about how you think about consumer engagement, where the consumer is driving how other consumers should engage with the brand, and they're leveraging the power of Gen AI and that. We work with a bunch of firms that are reimagining the way they look at their businesses, the way they look at some of their business processes very boldly in terms of how they reimagine it for a shift that's already happening. And it also means that with any such shift, with any exponential shift, the only thing you shouldn't do is to wait. Because that's the whole idea of exponential. I mean, I'm not too good at statistics or mathematics, but I know enough to know that with exponential, the one thing you can't do is get it right. And of course, I think Bangalore traffic is a bad example, but they say typically that if cars were not linearly accelerating, and if they were exponentially accelerating, you could never cross a road, you'd always die. Because you would never be able to gauge the speed at which it's coming. So similarly with these shifts, we just have to keep trying and doing things rather than figuring out when is the right time to ride this wave, because you'll never get it right with the speed at which things are moving. So then, of course, the question comes to, so how do you try and ride this wave? So I've got kind of 4 ideas out there that at least I feel as leaders we should be keeping in mind as you think about how to ride the wave. And riding the wave doesn't mean you'll get it right the first time itself, but it means that you're in the mindset of knowing that we need to ride this wave. So the first one is, don't forget the human being in this. It is fascinating when I hear people talk about Gen AI in the current context, but we are fascinated by the technology. We sometimes lose sight of the fact that all of this is just a means to an end, and the end is to create value. The end is to create value for a consumer, a human somewhere in that chain that is going to appreciate that value, and that's going to feed back into why that value makes sense. People talk about now it's going to be machine-to-machine marketing. That's true, but it's going to be machine to consumer. As you keep extending the chain, there's going to be a consumer or a human being at some point. The other part of the human that we tend to forget is, so I look at it internally for us as firms, the people who need to be part of the change. It's easy to sometimes fall into this trap of saying, I'm going to throw you at the deep end. If you can swim, that's awesome. If you can't, you weren't meant to kind of swim anyway. I think with Gen AI, the thing we've got to be careful about is that we have to lead our people through the change as well. And the thing about change, and that's the second human that I'm talking about, which is our own people, internal to our systems, who will help create the change that will then drive the ultimate value. The thing about change is, if you're not inspired by it, you're always intimidated by it. It's just simple human behavior. So we as leaders have to make sure that we're always communicating the why and how everyone can be a part of it. There's obviously a lot of interesting conversation on Gen AI is going to take away jobs or not take away jobs, and that really doesn't matter. That's a moot point. What's important is that with everything that makes it easier or more convenient to do something, we have a responsibility to learn how to do it more conveniently or more easily. And if you do that, you're always going to be able to create value. But how do you help people understand that? How do you help people kind of do that? On this, will it take away jobs or not? There's a conversation last week. In fact, we were having in this room itself last week. And the point I was making was that sometimes we approach these things as if value is finite, right? Which is, there is only that much value in the system. So now if a machine is doing it, I need less human beings. And that's not the case, because value itself is infinite. The world economy in 2000 was 30 trillion. The world in the last 25 years has seen a whole bunch of different innovations and technological shifts, by virtue of which, if you read all the media that was there, we should have needed less human beings than what we needed in 2000. We definitely need more. The World Employment Index has only been growing at about 2.8% every year. And the world economy is now at 110 trillion. So it's gone up 4x in the last 25 years. My bet is that it'll go up even faster, at a faster rate. We'll not have to wait for the next 25 years for it to become, let's say 440 trillion. And that'll be the change that'll happen, but we'll always need to create more value. So if you assume that more people will create more value, but they need to be enabled to create value, you think about it very differently, instead of thinking of it as a zero-sum game, that there is only that much value, so if I can get that out of a machine, I just need less human beings. I mean, that's at least not the way I think about it. Second is mindsets. I think the mindset is about being bold. If you look at, for example, we did some great work with Marriott last year. So Marriott, coming out of COVID, the big shift was the first travelers that came back were not the business travelers, were the leisure travelers. Leisure travelers were not looking for hotel rooms. They were looking for villas or places that were more, in their mind, cocooned, which gave health and safety. So we helped Marriott launch a completely new business line, Marriott Homes and Villas, which is now one of their fastest growing business segments. But to me, kudos for Marriott for being bold about saying, we're going to be doing this as something completely different. And now they've got a generative search, smart search that they've launched for the last 8 or 9 months, which is, again, changing the way they look at their business. So the important thing is being bold. And if you're not bold, you will do something incrementally only. And when you have the power of something of the size of AI in its kind of latest avatar, it's better to be bold than play safe. So I'm not saying don't play safe, but if you just limit yourself to playing safe, you're definitely under-leveraging what that opportunity is. The third idea is democratizing innovation. I think innovation is used like a medal, right? Which is, hey, this is the team in my company that innovates. And which means the rest stay off because you haven't earned the right to innovate. Your job is to wait for something to come out of the room with a different swipe card. And then when that comes out, we all go and just create more of it. I think that's the wrong way of thinking about what we have in our hands, because GenAI is not the realm of a few. It's the most democratized, I think, technology that's come out in a very, very long time. Anything that can be leveraged from the age group of 8 to 80 sounds like a good rhyme, but we know it goes on either side of that bookend as well, is just going to obviously create a difference in just how we live our lives. And if that is the case, you have to democratize innovation in how everybody in the firm, that's what we're doing internally. We are equipping everybody with the ability to innovate using GenAI in whatever context they're operating. And it could be in the micro context of the work they do, it could be in the macro context of the offering we create, it could be in an even more macro context of the world that we create. But everybody should feel the responsibility to innovate, which means if each one of us in our own perspective is not figuring out how am I doing something different, then I think we're missing the trick here. The other aspect of democratizing innovation is I think what Samir referred to, which is, if you look at the ecosystem of GCCs and service providers and startups, it almost feels like a slugfest to the finish, right? Which is for GCCs to win, service providers have to lose, startups find their way somewhere in between. And I think the opportunity we're missing there is, again, democratizing innovation. Because if that was an ecosystem that's innovating, we'll all move much further and much faster. Because when you have something that is moving so quickly that you need to leverage, it's a very self-limiting belief to think that you can do this alone. No one can. No one of these partners in that ecosystem is going to be better than everybody put together. The question is, how do you synthesize that? Right? How do you thread that together? Who takes lead or not is less important. What's more important is what gets created. And I think, so therefore, the democratizing innovation is not only internal to the firms and how we lead our people, it's also about how we think about the ecosystem around us and create something that can create larger value. The last one is integration over innovation. Now, I hear a lot of people, again, talk about GenAI in the context of, and I hear leaders really talk with a lot of pride. It's not misplaced, but it's just my observation. We built something completely brand new. So we just threw away whatever we had, and we went completely brand new, because that's easier to do. It could be in certain contexts, but a lot of the examples we are seeing is also how people are building on what they have, because the context is still as important, but what they're doing is they're shaping that context in a direction that creates more value. So when you have banks that are creating agentic architectures, and we work with a few of them, they're not saying, I just need a completely new bank. What they're saying is, what is the point of friction I have with my consumer today, and where can GenAI create that differentiated experience? It's not about just saying, Chuck, whatever you have, and let's go create a new bank. There was a very interesting perspective I heard from someone a few months back where they said, software is going to become like plastic. When plastic became really cheap to produce, we didn't care about how plastic was made. It became more important as to what is plastic used for. And they said that's what's going to happen to software at some point, that it'll just become like plastic, but it's going to be so easy to produce it that the larger question is, what do you do with it? But having said that, it doesn't mean that what we have today isn't valuable. So I think sometimes it can be very glamorous and exciting to just start completely afresh, and maybe in some cases it makes sense to break new ground. But integrating what you have, we worked with a large pharma company to really scrunch down their media legal review cycles, which saves millions of dollars. Most pharma companies spend a whole ton of money and time on media legal reviews, which we built into their LLM, and now they're off to the races on that. But that's built on what they currently have. It wasn't going and building a completely brand new platform. There are firms that are unlocking massive amount of insights, just connecting their existing data plumbing instead of trying to say, I need to always stand up a brand new platform. So those are at least the 4 ideas on how do you think about riding the wave. and not get caught on the other side of it. So if that to me is kind of the tactical business side of things. But here's, I think, where I want to make sure, where I kind of want to take the conversation to, which is ultimately the responsibility that we have as leaders is we get to set the agenda. We set the conversation. We get to make some of those decisions, a lot of them in fact, and therefore we set direction. And while doing that, where does our compass kind of veer towards, right? And I think business value is obviously a responsibility of ours. It's something that's, it's part of everybody's KPIs in some shape or form, in this room. But are we also focused on the human value that you're creating? So for example, I'm looking at some of the applications that are happening already in cancer research, right? Now, the businesses that are doing it in cancer research, that's great. It's creating more business value. To me, we're creating public platforms where you can take a whole bunch of medical imagery, right, and actually interpret them in low-resource environments for diagnosis. Now, that's human value. Because you're taking a segment of society that otherwise would not have had access to prognosis, and you're able to now create it for them. That's human value. Financial inclusion. There are people who are able to now leverage Gen AI platforms for financial literacy. There are citizen governance platforms. There are people who are able to understand policies, right? And at least get some sense of how to think about it, how to engage in that. You have microcredit systems that are now able to bring entrepreneurs or people with an aspiration to be an entrepreneur into the mix that wasn't possible earlier. That is human value. We've got now platforms that are working for climate change, looking at helping with what are the weather patterns, how they're changing, how do you make choices on crop rotation, other things that will help greater yield, create greater sustenance. That's human value. So obviously, business value is important, and I'm not for a second am I saying that's not important, but I think how do we extend our responsibility into also ensuring that there is a larger good that we can create with the power vested in us as leaders and the choices that we make? That's really important, which brings me then to value over vanity, right? So if you think of Gen AI as kind of the Iron Man, right, which is the suit and the human being. If the suit is Gen AI, then the human being is still the human being, and it's when the suit and the human being come together that you get Iron Man, who's blessed with superpowers. And I'm not getting into a Marvel versus this thing kind of debate. We'll just pick Iron Man as the winner for this morning. But what's important is what does Iron Man do is more important than having the Iron Man, because are we using that level of capability to truly create value, or are we doing it to drive what I call vanity? So when people are trying to create snow in deserts, where they're trying to do, that's vanity, right? But when you're trying to truly solve human problems, that is value. So again, as choices, we've got to figure out that are we about glory, which may not necessarily create value, or are we truly about making the world a better place, blessed by a technology and its pace of progress that opens up that possibility at least, right, and makes that happen. And therefore, we have a responsibility of building a legacy with purpose. I'll give you a small example. Electricity, right? It's one of the big changes that happened to mankind, definitely before I was around. But if you see the way the stories were read, how many of you remember who were the earliest adopters of electricity? It was textile mills. It's funnily enough, textile mills never come up for a conversation when people talk about electricity. They were the earliest adopters. Who were the most meaningful adopters of electricity? Automobile companies. Because the automobile companies reimagined their world through electricity. Textile companies basically just replaced steam engines. So history will not judge us by who used Gen AI first, right? But they'll definitely judge us by who used it most purposefully. And so the question is, the choices we're making today, are those choices about being incremental, or are we truly leveraging the power of what's possible? And as leaders, these are choices we make. Whether we like it or not, that's a responsibility that rests with us, and we can't wear that lightly. Because the choices we make are not choices that will show up Monday morning. They will show up weeks, months, and years to come. So as we make some of these choices, think about the purpose. Our purpose at Sapient is to help people thrive in the brave pursuit of next. And we find that very relevant in the realm of Gen AI, that how's each person equipped to, in their journey of next, to be more meaningful, more impactful, more efficient. So the last thought I'm going to leave you with then I've already heard the buzzer go off a couple of times. The last thought I'm going to leave you with is, with everything that's happening, there's a natural pace of progress, right? And that's exponential and everything we've talked about. So AI will change the world. I mean, we don't need a slide deck for that, right? And that's why I didn't put any numbers in my slide. That's going to happen. Even if none of us did anything, we didn't get together here on this Friday morning, AI will change the world. What's more important is, are we ready to lead it? So it's not about AI that you need to think about. The journey is within. How are we thinking about it, and do we see our role in shaping it and setting direction for it rather than just only learning it? Because if you end up learning it, my favorite analogy for this is, it's like taking a dinosaur for a walk. If you take a dinosaur for a walk, the biggest fallacy is that you're in control. All you're doing is you're holding the leash. It will go in the direction it's going to, and you will follow it. So if you don't want this to become the dinosaur that's going to take you for a walk, as leaders, we better set direction in where we want to take it. All right? Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.